When we think of a medieval jail, the first image that probably comes to mind is a dark, dank dungeon beneath a castle, filled with chained prisoners groaning in misery. The walls are dripping with moisture, rats scurry across the floor, and the air is so foul you can almost taste the rot. This picture isn't entirely wrong, but the reality of medieval jails was far more varied and often more brutal than the let-on. These were not places of rehabilitation or justice as we understand it today. In fact, the concept of jail itself served a very different purpose during the Middle Ages. In most medieval societies, jails were not used as long-term punishment. People were not typically sentenced to years behind bars the way modern justice systems do today. Instead, jails were holding spaces. They were used to keep the accused locked away until a trial or until the lord, bishop, or king decided what to do with them. Sometimes people were held while awaiting execution, exile, payment of a fine, or another form of punishment. The idea was not to reform the individual, but to control them until a verdict was passed. These places were often poorly managed and overcrowded. Towns and cities were not always equipped with purpose-built jails. Sometimes a room in the local castle or a converted cellar served the purpose. In smaller communities, an old storeroom, a church crypt, or even a wooden cage outdoors could function as a temporary holding cell. It wasn't uncommon for multiple people to be crammed into a single room with no bedding, poor ventilation, and little protection from the cold or heat. There were no guards patrolling with strict schedules or daily inspections. In many places, the jail was simply a locked room with minimal supervision. Life inside these spaces was rough. Inmates were responsible for their own food, clothing, and hygiene. That meant if you didn't have friends or family bringing you meals, you could go hungry. There was no prison kitchen or scheduled mealtime. Some prisoners resorted to begging from their jailers or fellow inmates. Others relied on the mercy of the townspeople, created a hierarchy among prisoners, where those with connections and resources fared far better than the poor or strangers. Disease ran rampant. Lice and fleas were constant companions. The smell inside these jails was said to be overwhelming, a mix of unwashed bodies, rot, human waste, and moldy straw. Punishment within the jail was not unheard of either. Jailers often doubled as enforcers and could be cruel or corrupt. Bribery was common. If you wanted a better place to sleep, more food, or even a chance at freedom, a well-placed coin might sway the right person. For those without money or social standing, abuse was frequent. In some places, prisoners were shackled to the walls or floors, not for security reasons, but as a method of humiliation and physical torment. Others were left in complete darkness for days or weeks at a time, as a way to break their spirit. Torture did happen, though it was more common during interrogations or in the context of political or religious trials. Inquisitions, for example, sometimes used jail cells as places to soften up prisoners before formal questioning began. The tools of the trade varied. Iron chains, thumbscrews, and the infamous rack were used not just to extract confessions, but to demonstrate authority and dominance. The mere threat of torture was often enough to force cooperation, especially from those already weakened by starvation and disease. Despite this grim reality, medieval jails were not always places of complete chaos. Some larger cities, like London or Paris, developed more organized systems over time. In these jails, there might be some effort to separate prisoners by offense. A thief might be housed in one cell, while a debt prisoner was kept elsewhere. Debtors made up a significant portion of medieval jail populations. In fact, being poor was often reason enough to end up behind bars. If you owed someone money and couldn't pay it back, you could be jailed until your family paid your debt for you. This system punished poverty more than crime and trapped countless people in a cycle of suffering with little way out. Women and children were not exempt from incarceration. Female prisoners often faced even harsher treatment. They could be imprisoned for theft, infidelity, or simply being accused of witchcraft. Mothers with infants were sometimes locked up with their children, forced to care for them in unbearable conditions. Children accused of petty crimes were thrown in with adults and subject to the same miserable environment. There were no special considerations for age or vulnerability. Not all prisoners stayed locked away for long. Trials could be surprisingly quick. especially in feudal areas where the lord of the manor held the final word. In some cases, a trial consisted of little more than a brief audience with the local authority, who would determine guilt based on witness testimony or community reputation. If found guilty, the punishment might be carried out the same day. That could mean public flogging, branding, cutting off a hand, or, in severe cases, execution. Jail time was a prelude to these events, not a substitute. One curious aspect of medieval jail life was the presence of the jailers, or jailers. These individuals were responsible for locking up prisoners and maintaining basic order. But their role was not a government-funded post in most places. Often, jailers had to make their own income, which led to corruption and bribery. Prisoners might be charged for everything from removing their shackles to being allowed outside for a breath of fresh air. A better cell or basic human comfort came at a price. Without money or connections, many prisoners suffered quietly in the worst corners of the jail. There were also religious and charitable efforts to support prisoners. Monks, nuns, and other religious figures sometimes visited jails to offer spiritual comfort, food, or even legal aid. Some orders took pity on the jailed and provided basic supplies. In a few rare cases, prisoners were released into the custody of the church, especially if they claimed sanctuary or were deemed penitent. These gestures were far from universal, but they offered a sliver of humanity in an otherwise bleak world. As time passed, some parts of medieval Europe began experimenting with more structured forms of incarceration. By the late Middle Ages, certain cities had larger purpose-built prisons with more organized systems for handling inmates. These were still far from humane by modern standards, but they reflected a slow shift in thinking. Some early prisons even tried to instill discipline, making inmates follow a schedule or perform labor. These were the precursors to the penal systems that would emerge in the modern era. In popular imagination, the medieval dungeon remains the go-to symbol of cruelty and despair. But the truth is that medieval jails were not always underground or hidden in castles. They could be as mundane as a locked room in a town hall, or as makeshift as a cage in the village square. What united them was a disregard for human comfort and a focus on control rather than justice. The jail was a tool, not a sentence. It was a place where power was enforced, not questioned. So next time you see a medieval jail portrayed in a film or a video game, take a moment to look beyond the flickering torchlight and chains. Imagine the real people who lived and suffered in those spaces. The man imprisoned over a petty debt. The woman falsely accused of sorcery. The child locked up for stealing bread. These jails were not just places of punishment. They were reflections of a society where class, power, and fear ruled more than fairness or truth. The medieval jail was not meant to be a place for second chances. It was a stop on the way to judgment, a cold waiting room before a brutal sentence. There was no pretense of reform, no comfort, no dignity. But within those grim walls, you could still find moments of humanity, a whispered prayer, a shared crust of bread, a hand reached out in the darkness. Those small acts are what remind us that even in the cruelest systems, people still tried to hold on to their humanity. And that, more than the rats or the iron chains, is what made a medieval jail a truly unforgettable place. Thanks for stepping into the shadows with us to explore what a medieval jail was really like. It's easy to imagine chains, darkness, and damp stone walls. But behind those images were real people, living in conditions most of us couldn't endure for a day. These jails weren't designed for justice or second chances. They were meant to hold, to punish, and to remind everyone who held the power. From the poor man imprisoned over a debt to the accused which locked away without proof, every cell held a story. And while the walls were cold and the air thick with suffering, the human spirit still flickered in the darkness. A shared crust of bread, a whispered prayer, or a moment of unexpected kindness made even the worst places slightly more bearable. If this look into the grim corners of medieval justice moved you or made you think differently about history, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share it with others who love uncovering the raw and often forgotten truths of the past. Drop a comment below and tell us what surprised you most. Until next time, stay curious and never stop asking what life was really like back then.